On 12th of February 1904, the winter light over Cumberland Island, Georgia fell thin and salt pale on the terraces of Dungeness, the sprawling Carnegie estate. Inside, in a south-facing sitting room, Lucy Coleman Carnegie adjusted a low bowl of camellias on a marble-top table, turning each bloom so the best face met the room. A visiting journalist from Harper's Weekly had described Cumberland as a private world of sea wind and library silence, noting Lucy's habit of arranging flowers before breakfast, as if to instruct the day in order. It read like a compliment. It also read like a warning. Beyond the tall windows, the Atlantic moved restlessly against the barrier shore that made this world possible. Dunes, marsh, and tide holding the sea just far enough away. Lucy's hands lingered over the flowers a moment too long, as if she could pin the morning in place. The island still belonged to her family, the trust not yet written, the erosion not yet measured, but the water was already learning the paths it would later take. The camellias were perfect. The future, quietly, was not. By early February 1884, when Thomas Morrison Carnegie and his wife, Lucy Coleman Carnegie, stepped ashore at Cumberland Island to inspect the old Dungeness property, the ruins of Revolutionary War, General Nathaniel Greene's estate, later owned by the family of General Light Horse Harry Lee. The place had already lived several lives, colonial plantation, war-scarred ruin, and now, in Lucy's calculating vision, a potential winter refuge for an industrial fortune built on steel. Thomas was the younger brother of Andrew Carnegie, and while his fortune was modest compared to his brother's empire, it was more than sufficient to purchase an entire barrier island and remake it according to their desires. The live oaks creaked in the February wind, their massive branches spreading horizontally under the weight of centuries, crusted with salt spray and draped with Spanish moss that swayed in patterns dictated by prevailing winds from the Atlantic. The only constant sound was surf, muffled by the dune line but insistent, a rhythmic reminder that this island existed at the boundary between land and sea, between stability and flux. The air smelled of salt, crushed oyster shells along the paths, and the faint sweetness of early blooming camellias that had survived decades of neglect in the old gardens. Estate papers preserved in the National Park Service archives and the Georgia Historical Society show that within months of that first visit, Lucy urged the purchase not just of the Dungeness site, but of thousands of additional acres. Eventually, the Carnegie family would control roughly 90% of Cumberland's 36,000 acres, from the southern tip to High Point and beyond. She was determined to build a self-contained family domain with a main house, formal gardens, service buildings, staff cottages, and all the infrastructure necessary to support a wealthy family's seasonal residence on a remote barrier island, a place, as one later National Park Service history notes, where inconvenience was to be eliminated as far as money and planning could achieve. The construction of the new Dungeness mansion began in 1884 and was completed by 1886, employing local tabby construction techniques, a mixture of oyster shells, lime, sand, and water that had been used in coastal building for centuries, combined with more conventional brick and timber. The house that emerged was vast, a Queen Anne-style mansion with turrets and wraparound porches, 59 rooms, and modern amenities including plumbing, electricity generated by the estate's own power plant, and a sophisticated system for collecting rainwater and pumping it throughout the house. Lucy personally supervised the landscaping, ordering the planting of formal gardens with paths lined by crushed shells, ornamental plantings, and areas designated for cutting flowers that would supply the house year-round. In that founding decision, to purchase thousands of acres of Barrier Island and build upon it as if it were as permanent as granite, lay a fundamental bargain with the coast itself. Wealth and ambition trading the liquidity of capital for the apparent solidity of land on what geologists would later definitively identify as one of the most dynamic and mobile landscapes in North America. The island had been chosen deliberately for its isolation, which promised privacy from the industrial world that had generated the Carnegie fortune, and for its beauty, which offered an aesthetic counterpoint to the grime and noise of steel mills and urban life. But it was also, though few in the family would have said so explicitly in 1884, chosen to keep the world at arm's length to create a controlled environment where Carnegie children could grow up surrounded by nature but insulated from the social and economic turbulence of the Gilded Age, where labor strikes and anarchist bombings were becoming increasingly common realities in industrial cities. The foundations Lucy ordered laid in tabby and brick sunk into the sandy soil of a barrier island, would indeed one day stand roofless and open to the sky, gradually being reclaimed by the natural vegetation of the island, ringed by seabirds, and the descendants of horses that were brought to the island during the plantation era and had gone feral after abandonment. By April 1901, Grayfield, the substantial colonial revival house that Lucy Coleman Carnegie built for her daughter Margaret Carnegie Ricketson on a rise above the marsh on the northern part of Cumberland Island, stood complete, its long porch lined with wicker chairs and potted ferns that required constant tending in the salt air. Family records preserved in the Carnegie estate papers and later documentation prepared for the National Register of Historic Places describe Grayfield as one element of a vast private estate that stretched from Dungeness in the south northward to Plum Orchard, another grand house built for Lucy's son William in 1898, and beyond, creating a private corridor of land and water controlled primarily by Carnegie women after Thomas Carnegie's death in 1886. The house sat on elevated ground, as elevated as a barrier island permits, perhaps 15 feet above sea level, commanding views over salt marshes where spartina grass grew in zones dictated by tidal inundation, shifting from tall, smooth cordgrass in the frequently flooded low marsh to shorter, sparser vegetation at higher elevations. The air around Grayfield carried different smells depending on the tide. At low tide, the rich, slightly sulfurous smell of exposed mud flats. At high tide, the cleaner scent of salt water mixing with the sweetness of whatever was blooming in the cultivated gardens near the house. In the mornings during the winter season, when the family was in residence, Margaret Ricketson is documented in family letters and later oral histories as hosting what she called instructional walks for younger cousins, the daughters and nieces who would inherit their own portions of the island and need to understand how to manage both the social and practical demands of such an estate. These walks followed shell paths that had been carefully maintained by groundskeepers, paths that wound through areas of the formal gardens where plants were labeled with small metal tags, identifying species and origin, and where Margaret would point out which plantings were thriving in the island's challenging environment and which required constant intervention to survive. The sound of garden clippers, the snick of sharp blades cutting through flower stems, mingled with the rustle of long skirts sweeping over crushed shell paths and the distant, ever-present thud of waves breaking on the beach beyond the dunes. These morning walks often culminated in the cutting of flowers for the dining room table, an activity that served multiple purposes. It maintained the garden by encouraging new growth, it provided fresh decoration for the house, and it offered practical training in the aesthetic judgment that was considered essential for women of their class. The flowers, camellias in winter, roses in spring, whatever could be coaxed to bloom in the sandy soil and salt air, would be carried back to the house in flat baskets and arranged in the cool of the dining room, where servants had already placed appropriate vases on the sideboard. The act of arranging those flowers became part of the younger girl's education, a lesson in creating visual harmony, in understanding color and form, in the patient manipulation of natural materials into pleasing compositions. But it was also training in a broader sense, training the eye for balance in a world where their own futures would be balanced just as carefully through marriage negotiations, social connections, and the management of inherited wealth. The flowers stood in their vases for perhaps a week, refreshed daily with water, their petals gradually browning at the edges before being replaced with fresh blooms. The cycle was repetitive, ritualistic, and meant to appear effortless, even though it required constant attention and labor. But neither Margaret nor the younger women she was training could see. What would not become fully clear until decades later when geologists began systematically studying barrier island dynamics was that the ground beneath their feet was not as stable as it appeared. Barrier island geology operates on timescales that make human perception unreliable. Changes that seem imperceptible in a single lifetime accumulate into dramatic transformations over decades and centuries. Studies by the United States Geological Survey and later by National Park Service researchers have documented that sectors of Cumberland's shoreline have long histories of erosion and overwash, their positions migrating landward with each major hurricane and each incremental rise in sea level. While Margaret's table bouquets were refreshed daily in the dining room of Grayfield, the line of the beach outside, invisible from the house but less than a mile away across the interior maritime forest, was inching backward almost imperceptibly each year. The island was not static. It was slowly moving, its sand recycling from ocean beach to dune to overwash fan, its shape responding to currents and storms in ways that the Carnegie family's wealth and engineering could slow but never stop. On a crisp day in January 1889, just 3 years after the completion of the new Dungeness mansion on Cumberland, a steam launch from Brunswick, Georgia cut across St. Simon Sound to Jekyll Island, another barrier island approximately 30 miles north of Cumberland, ferrying members of the newly opened Jekyll Island Club and their families to what would quickly become one of the most exclusive retreats in America. Munsey's magazine would soon describe it in breathless terms as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. And while such claims were typical of Gilded Age promotional rhetoric, in this case they contained more than a little truth. The club's membership roster, limited by design to 100 families, represented an extraordinary concentration of American industrial and financial power. J.P. Morgan, whose banking empire financed railroads and steel companies. William Rockefeller, brother of John D. and a major force in Standard Oil. Joseph Pulitzer, whose newspapers shaped public opinion in New York and beyond. William K. Vanderbilt, heir to the railroad fortune that had made his family synonymous with Gilded Age excess. Contemporary estimates, probably exaggerated but not wildly so, suggested that club members collectively controlled approximately 1/6 of the world's wealth, a staggering proportion when one considers that this was a single small resort on a single small island. Photographs preserved in the Jekyll Island Museum archives and in family collections show women stepping carefully from the launch onto the club's dock, dressed in high-neck day dresses appropriate for winter travel, their hands gloved against the January air. Despite Georgia's relatively mild climate, they were escorted up wooden walkways to cottages, substantial houses by any reasonable standard, but never called mansions in the peculiar language of the American resort, where understatement was itself a form of status signaling. The cottages, designed by prominent architects and furnished with European antiques and modern conveniences, were arranged along carefully planned roads that wound through maritime forest and opened onto lawns that sloped down toward tidal creeks. On verandas facing those lawns and the serpentine waterways that cut through the island's marsh systems, the women of Jekyll Island repeated rituals that would have been familiar to them from Newport or Bar Harbor or any of the other fashionable summer resorts that dotted the northeastern seaboard. Structured tea hours in the late afternoon, when particular people were expected to call on particular others. Garden walks taken in small groups at specified times. Card tables set up in sitting rooms for games that were as much about social positioning as about the cards themselves. But here on Jekyll, the natural environment pressed closer than it did at more established resorts. The sea was not a distant element glimpsed from cliff paths, but an immediate presence, visible from most cottages, audible always, its tides dictating when the club's boats could depart for Brunswick or coastal excursions. The island's single seasonal road, which connected the clubhouse with the various cottages and with the cleared areas designated for recreation, marked a clear boundary between curated, controlled space, lawns maintained by teams of groundskeepers, paths lined with plantings selected for their ability to survive in the harsh coastal environment and the wild, low-lying salt marsh and maritime forest that covered most of the island's interior. Beyond the cleared areas, Jekyll remained what it had always been, a shifting assemblage of sand and mud and spartina grass, home to alligators and herons and fiddler crabs, a place shaped by forces that paid no attention to human desires for permanence and order. A narrator examining this period from the vantage point of the 21st century might note that the presence of these wealthy families helped transform what had been, just a few years earlier, relatively undisturbed barrier island landscape into a stage for status display, a place where having a Jekyll Island address signaled membership in the absolute pinnacle of American society. But that same narrator would also have to acknowledge a truth that the club members themselves probably understood at some level, even if they didn't dwell on it. This stage had to be rebuilt, in effect, every year, against the persistent forces of wind and tide and storm. The club operated on a seasonal basis, opening in January and closing in March or April, when the heat and humidity of the Georgia coast became oppressive and the members returned north to their primary residences. Each winter's opening required repairs to docks damaged by fall storms, restoration of paths eroded by heavy rains, and replacement of plants that had died during the off-season. The club's guest lists and membership rosters grew thicker with each passing year, recording an increasing number of America's wealthiest families, even as, invisible in the club's official records, the beach along Jekyll's northern shore gradually narrowed, losing centimeters and eventually meters to the persistent erosion that affects all Atlantic Barrier islands. By the late 19th century, American industrial fortunes generated by railroads, steel, oil, finance, and international trade sought summer and winter refugees on islands from Mount Desert in Maine to Cumberland and Jekyll in Georgia. These barrier islands and rocky offshore islands offered multiple attractions to the wealthy: seclusion from the urban masses whose labor had generated these fortunes, sea air that was believed, with some medical justification, to be healthier than city air, and the illusion of permanent enclosure, the sense that on an island one could create a self-contained world operating according to rules set by the island's owners rather than by broader society. Yet geologists examining these same landscapes would later describe barrier islands as among the most mobile and dynamic environments on Earth. Unlike continental bedrock or even the alluvial plains of major river systems, barrier islands are fundamentally temporary features, assemblages of sand and shell and organic material that migrate landward over centuries and millennia as sea levels rise and storms redistribute sediment. The wealthy families who built grand houses on these islands in the 1880s and 1890s were, without fully realizing it, engaging in a gamble with geological time, betting that their houses and gardens would outlast their own tenure and perhaps their children's, but building on ground that was not and could never be truly stable. For Gilded Age families, islands functioned as what might be called laboratories of privilege, controlled environments where the mechanisms of wealth and social power could be studied in their purest form. Cumberland Island operated as a single-family domain, where Lucy Carnegie and her children could quite literally draw the boundaries of their world, deciding who could visit and under what circumstances. Jekyll Island represented a different model, a club structure where membership itself became a form of social currency, where the right to purchase or rent a cottage required approval from existing members, creating concentric circles of inclusion and exclusion. Mount Desert Island in Maine offered yet another variation, a collection of private cottage kingdoms where families like the Rockefellers and Astors built vast summer houses perched on granite cliffs above Frenchman Bay, each estate a separate principality but all participating in a shared social season. Many of these island retreats would later burn. The Great Bar Harbor Fire of 1947 destroyed numerous Mount Desert cottages, or erode or be repurposed as the families that built them died out, or lost their fortunes, or simply lost interest in maintaining such expensive and isolated properties. But in their heyday, roughly from 1880 to 1930, they served an important social function. They were training grounds where a generation of heiresses learned to understand isolation and natural beauty as assets to be managed rather than as simple pleasures to be enjoyed, where the act of arranging flowers or planning a garden walk became practice for the larger work of managing wealth, property, and social position. In May 1895, as wealthy American families from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia enrolled their teenage daughters at Swiss finishing schools clustered around Lake Geneva, institutions with names like Chateau Montchoisy, Villa Beausite, and Institut Selig, prospectuses promised that scenery itself would serve as moral influence. The combination of water, mountains, and carefully cultivated gardens, these brochures suggested, would shape the young women's characters as surely as their formal instruction in French conversation, German grammar, music theory, and the subtle arts of deportment and social grace. One such curriculum, preserved in a school catalog held in the archives of a private collector and reproduced in studies of women's education, lists the daily schedule with remarkable precision. Morning classes in languages from 8:30 to 12, luncheon at 12:30 taken communally in the dining room under the headmistress's observation, promenades under supervision, from 2 to 4 along the lakefront or into the nearby hills, afternoon practice hours for music, and the conduct of correspondence and reception of callers. From 4:30 to 6, dinner at 7, and evening study or proved reading until lights out at 10. The schedule left almost no time unstructured, operating on the principle that young women of this class required constant guidance to develop proper habits of mind and body. Though Lucy Coleman Carnegie kept her daughter's main schooling closer to home, hiring private tutors and governesses who came to Cumberland and to the Carnegie residence in New Jersey. The educational ideal represented by these Swiss schools shaped Cumberland's seasonal life as surely as it shaped the lives of the heiresses who actually attended such institutions. The concept of the finished young woman, fluent in at least French and passably competent in German or Italian, trained in music to a level that allowed her to perform credibly at social gatherings, able to move through formal social situations with apparent ease, and to manage servants and households with quiet authority, was the product these schools promised to deliver. And it was the product that Lucy Carnegie and women like her sought to produce through their own domestic educational programs. Letters preserved in the Carnegie estate records held at the Georgia Historical Society include correspondence with tutors and companions hired to provide both academic instruction and training in what the letters delicately term ladylike accomplishments. These accomplishments included the practical skills of household management, but also the aesthetic abilities, flower arranging, decorative needlework, the planning of table settings and menus that signaled cultivation and refinement. On Cumberland, the regime was perhaps less regimented than at a Swiss boarding school, but the underlying assumptions were identical. Young women required careful shaping, their natural impulses channeled and refined until they could perform the role of elite femininity with the same apparent effortlessness that professional actresses brought to the stage. On the veranda at Dungeness on a May morning in 1895, a teenage Carnegie daughter might spend an hour arranging camellias and early roses in low bowls for the dining room and the main parlor, supervised by her mother or by an older female relative who would offer quiet corrections, this stem too prominent, that color combination too bold, the overall effect slightly unbalanced and requiring adjustment. The exercise was simultaneously aesthetic and moral. It taught visual judgment, patience, attention to detail, and the principle that even the most casual-seeming domestic arrangements required thought and planning. And it reinforced, though perhaps more subtly than anyone would have articulated, the lesson that a woman's proper sphere was the home, and that her influence would be exercised not through direct political or economic power, but through the indirect power of creating beautiful, harmonious environments that reflected well on her family and class. The islands, Cumberland for the Carnegies, Jekyll for club members, Mount Desert for the northern families, served in this context as quiet finishing schools, outdoor extensions of the formal educational institutions that taught similar lessons in indoor settings. The sea, always audible and often visible from the houses, became perhaps the nearest thing to an uninvited witness, an element that could not be controlled or dismissed, that reminded even the wealthiest families that their power had limits. But those limits were distant enough in the 1890s that they could be ignored or aestheticized. The ocean was a beautiful view, a source of healthful air, a boundary that protected privacy. It was not yet in the minds of most island residents a threat. By March 1903, household instructions for Dungeness and Grayfield, preserved in fragments in family papers and reconstructed through National Park Service research, included not only the expected details about menus and staffing schedules, but also tide tables and ferry timetables, practical documents that reminded even the wealthiest families that island luxury had to accommodate natural rhythms that money could not alter. The Carnegie estates depended on regular launches from the mainland for supplies, mail, newspapers, and visitors, and the launches in turn depended on having sufficient water depth at the docks, which meant coordinating departures and arrivals with the tides that rose and fell approximately every 12 hours, according to the moon's pull. Family papers held at the Georgia Archives describe the elaborate choreography of island dining during the winter season when the family was in residence. Formal dinners at Dungeness often involved multiple courses requiring ingredients and wines that had to be ordered from Jacksonville or even from New York, transported by rail to the Georgia coast, and then ferried across to Cumberland. The timing of these deliveries became a logistical challenge that fell primarily to the women of the household, who were responsible for planning menus far enough in advance to allow for ordering and shipping, while also being prepared to adjust plans if launches were delayed by weather or mechanical problems. At these elaborate dinners, served in the Dungeness dining room at a table that could seat 20 or more, illuminated by candles and by the estate's own electric lighting system, young Carnegie women were subject to correction that was quiet but persistent. Posture was monitored constantly. Shoulders back, spine straight, head level, no slouching even after hours at the table. Conversational tone was regulated. Voices kept low and modulated. Topics selected for their appropriateness to mixed company and to the specific guests present. The young women learned to read the subtle signals that passed between their mother and other senior women at the table, a glance indicating that someone had spoken out of turn, a small shift in position suggesting that the conversation needed to be redirected, a raised eyebrow communicating disapproval without a word being spoken. The physical environment reinforced these lessons. The dining room at Dungeness, like those at Grayfield and Plum Orchard, was designed with high ceilings that amplified sound slightly, making raised voices uncomfortably conspicuous. The furniture, heavy carved pieces that were fashionable in the 1880s and 1890s, was deliberately formal, discouraging relaxed postures. Even the placement of mirrors and windows served an educational purpose. Young women could glance at their reflections to check their appearance, while the windows provided views of the carefully maintained gardens, visual reminders of the aesthetic standards the family cultivated. An early House Beautiful article from this period discussing Grayfield's interior arrangement evokes the careful placement of porch furniture, ferns and jardinières, and masses of potted greenery as essential elements of the house's charm and character. But behind that charm lay something more calculated. The same daughters who supervised the positioning of ferns and the refreshing of cut flowers in vases were learning the skills they would need as married women managing their own households, orchestrating their own dinner parties, and maintaining their own social positions. They were internalizing the connection between physical arrangement and social outcome, learning that the placement of a chair or the choice of flowers for a centerpiece could signal messages about taste, about wealth, about one's understanding of current fashions and social expectations. Outside the carefully maintained grounds of the Carnegie estates, the island's back barrier, marsh, and shoreline told a different story. United States Geological Survey reconstructions of Cumberland's coastal history, based on historical maps and aerial photographs going back to the mid-19th century, now document that North Cumberland's eastern shore has experienced significant erosion over a 145-year period, with marsh edges retreating by multiple meters, and in some areas by tens of meters, even in locations where houses and other structures remained safely inland. The process is driving this erosion. Rising sea levels, changes in tidal inlet dynamics, the gradual landward migration of the entire island system, operated on timescales longer than human attention spans but faster than human lives, creating changes that were individually imperceptible but cumulatively dramatic. The tide charts pinned to the kitchen wall in the Dungeness service wing, consulted daily by the staff coordinating launch schedules, were practical tools for managing the logistics of island life. But viewed from a 21st century perspective with the benefit of more than a century of accumulated geological data, those tide charts now read like early notes on vulnerability, documentary evidence that the Carnegie estates existed at the boundary between controlled, predictable human systems and uncontrollable natural processes. Every perfectly laid table in the grand dining rooms stood ultimately on sand whose long-term position could never be fixed, on an island whose very existence was conditional and temporary from a geological perspective, even if it appeared solid and permanent to the people living there. In August 1906, the society pages of the New York Times and regional newspapers from Boston, Philadelphia, and even Chicago tracked the summer arrivals at Bar Harbor on Mount Desert Island in Maine, where families with names like Rockefeller, Astor, and Vanderbilt occupied cliffside cottages, a deliberately modest term for houses that in many cases exceeded 50 rooms and required staffs of dozens to maintain. The documentation of these estates in National Register nominations and in architectural histories records properties with features that rivaled European country houses. Formal gardens designed by leading landscape architects, tennis courts with grandstands for spectators, private yacht landings with elaborate boathouses, and miles of carriage roads built at enormous expense to allow families to drive through the landscape in comfort while enjoying carefully framed views. Mount Desert Island differed from the barrier islands of the Georgia coast in fundamental ways. It was composed primarily of granite solid bedrock thrust up by ancient geological forces and sculpted by glaciers during the most recent ice age, where Cumberland and Jekyll were temporary accumulations of sand and mud that would migrate and reshape themselves over centuries. Mount Desert's basic topography had been stable for millions of years. The island rose dramatically from the sea, with mountains, small by Western standards but impressive on the Atlantic coast, that provided both spectacular views and protection from the worst coastal storms. Building on Mount Desert felt, and in many ways was, fundamentally different from building on a barrier island. Yet despite these geological differences, the social rituals enacted on Mount Desert replicated in essential ways those performed on Jekyll and Cumberland. Within the great houses, structures like the turrets, Reef Point, and dozens of others whose names evoked romance and permanence, heiresses rehearsed similar performances of elite femininity. Morning letters were written on monogrammed stationery at desks positioned to overlook gardens or ocean views, the writer's hands moving in practice script learned through years of penmanship instruction. Flower arranging occupied the hours before luncheon, with blooms cut from the estate's gardens and arranged in vases throughout the public rooms according to aesthetic principles that combined formal rules. Certain colors and forms were considered appropriate for certain rooms and occasions, with individual expression within acceptable bounds. Carefully supervised excursions by carriage or by the small steam launches that many families maintained allowed young women to be seen in appropriate contexts, driving the carriage roads that John D. Rockefeller Jr. would eventually donate to what became Acadia National Park, taking tea at one of the resort hotels where one might encounter other families of similar standing, attending services at St. Saviour's Episcopal Church where pews were effectively reserved for particular families season after season. These activities were not spontaneous recreations, but carefully staged movements through a social landscape as deliberately planned as the physical landscape of carriage roads and gardens. Diaries and memoirs from Mount Desert Island residents during this period, preserved in collections at the Abbey Museum and in various family archives, describe with remarkable consistency the expectations placed on young women to be seen in the right places at the right hours, a form of social navigation that paralleled the literal navigation of the yachts that threaded through the foggy channels and among the rocky islands that studded Frenchman Bay. Being seen required not just presence but appropriate presentation, the correct clothing for each occasion, morning dress, afternoon dress, evening dress, each with its own specific requirements, the correct companions, properly chaperoned for unmarried women, strategically chosen to suggest particular social connections, and the correct demeanor, interested but not eager, friendly but not familiar, graceful but not conspicuously performative. The islands, whether granite or sand, whether northern or southern, offered their residents the illusion of escape from the cities where most of these families made their fortunes and maintained their primary residences. But etiquette manuals, maternal letters, and the constant surveillance of one's peers kept social rules as firmly in place on the islands as they were in Fifth Avenue drawing rooms or at Newport balls. If anything, the concentrated nature of island society, the same families seeing each other repeatedly throughout a season, the limited opportunities to avoid people one might wish to avoid, made the rules more rather than less important. Grace in this context meant knowing exactly how far one could step toward the edge of acceptability, whether the edge of a cliff path or the edge of a conversation, without appearing uncontrolled or socially incompetent. When a catastrophic fire swept through Bar Harbor in October 1947, driven by extraordinary drought conditions and gale force winds, it destroyed more than 170 houses, including many of the grandest cottages that had defined the resort's character. The fire erased not only the physical architecture of Gilded Age Bar Harbor, but also the theaters in which this particular version of controlled grace and elite performance had been enacted. The surviving estates, and some did survive, could never fully recreate the social world that had existed before the fire, in part because that world had already been fading for decades as fortunes declined and social patterns shifted, and in part because the sheer concentration of grand houses had been essential to creating the competitive social environment that made Bar Harbor what it had been. In February 1910, a secret meeting took place at the Jekyll Island Club. Secret not from club members and their families, who could not help but notice the unusual gathering, but from the press and the public who would have been intensely interested had they known. A group of powerful financiers, including Senator Nelson Aldrich, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury A. Piatt Andrew, and representatives of the nation's largest banks convened in the clubhouse to draft the preliminary outlines of what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. The meeting has been extensively documented by historians of American banking, with scholars noting the irony that one of the nation's most important financial reforms was planned at a resort that symbolized concentrated private wealth and deliberate exclusivity. While these male power brokers met in closed sessions in the clubhouse, the women of Jekyll Island, wives, daughters, sisters, moved through their own structured days according to different rhythms. Period photographs preserved in the Jekyll Island Museum archives show them walking the crushed shell paths and well-maintained lawns in tailored suits that represented the latest fashions from Paris and New York, their hands gloved despite Georgia's mild February weather, pausing to exchange what society pages would later describe as informal yet important visits. The clothing was significant. Even in a resort setting, standards of dress had to be maintained, with specific outfits appropriate for morning walks, afternoon teas, and evening dinners. The gloves were particularly important. A woman appearing outdoors with bare hands would have been as conspicuous and socially marked as one appearing without shoes. These women's conversations, unlike the financial planning happening in the clubhouse, went largely unrecorded, but their presence at Jekyll was itself newsworthy in certain contexts. Society columns in the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and other major newspapers tracked the movements of prominent families between their various seasonal residences, and being able to report that one had wintered at Jekyll carried significant social weight. The club's deliberate inaccessibility, membership was strictly limited and expensive. The island could only be reached by private boat, and casual visitors were not permitted, made Jekyll's presence a marker of having achieved the absolute pinnacle of American social standing. Their names sometimes appeared in these newspapers attached to philanthropic activities. Mrs. Name has returned from her winter at Jekyll Island and will shortly give a musical for the benefit of charitable cause. The islands thus fed a larger circuit of publicity and social positioning, exclusive retreats whose very remoteness and selectivity amplified the social currency of their residents' eventual return to cities where broader society could observe and envy their status. The ritual of arranging flowers in a Jekyll cottage drawing room, selecting which blooms might appear in a photograph submitted to Town and Country, or might be mentioned in a society column's description of a particular woman's aesthetic sensibilities, became one quiet way that women could participate in curating their own public images. In stark contrast to this attention to social positioning and public perception, the island's physical future remained largely unremarked and unconsidered. The club's members and their families assumed, as wealthy people building on real estate generally assume, that the land beneath their cottages was fundamentally stable and that their investments in buildings and landscaping would appreciate or at least maintain their value indefinitely. Only much later would coastal geologists and environmental historians, conducting systematic studies with modern technology, document that more than half of Jekyll Island's beaches have experienced significant retreat since the mid-19th century, that the island's northern shore has lost substantial width to erosion, and that the back barrier marshes have undergone changes in vegetation patterns and channel configurations driven by rising sea levels and altered tidal dynamics. The same newspapers that in 1910 celebrated Jekyll's exclusivity and social importance would by the 1950s and 1960s be publishing articles about efforts to stabilize the island's eroding beaches, about the challenges of maintaining infrastructure on a barrier island, and eventually about the state of Georgia's purchase of the island and its conversion into a state park open to the public, a transformation that would have been unthinkable to the club's founding members. The elaborate social world that had been constructed on Jekyll's carefully maintained grounds proved, in retrospect, to be as temporary as the sand beneath those grounds, both subject to forces larger than individual wealth or collective social power could indefinitely resist. In January 1916, Lucy Coleman Carnegie died at the family's New Jersey residence, her death marking the end of an era for Cumberland Island and initiating a complex transition of power and property that would shape the island's fate for the remainder of the 20th century. With her death came the implementation of a complicated legal trust that she had designed with her attorneys to keep Cumberland Island in Carnegie hands for as long as possible, preventing the subdivision and sale that might otherwise have occurred as her 9 surviving children and numerous grandchildren inherited and eventually needed or wanted to liquidate their shares. Trust documents preserved in the Georgia archives spell out in meticulous legal language the restrictions Lucy imposed on the family's use of their inherited property. Individual heirs could occupy houses on the island and could pass their property to their own heirs, but they could not sell to outsiders without the agreement of other family members, could not subdivide the larger estates into smaller parcels, and were subject to various other constraints designed to keep the island as a unified Carnegie family domain. The trust represented Lucy's attempt to project her will forward in time, to bind her descendants into maintaining the world she had created, even after her death. For the younger women of the Carnegie family, Lucy's daughters like Margaret Ricketson and her many granddaughters who would inherit portions of the island, this legal architecture was part of their social and practical education in ways that extended far beyond learning to arrange flowers or manage servants. Letters from later decades, preserved in family papers and in National Park Service research files, show these women debating the challenges of island stewardship, how to maintain expensive infrastructure like roads and docks when costs were rising and individual family fortunes were no longer what they had been in Lucy's day, whether to allow limited development that might generate income to support maintenance costs, how to respond to approaches from conservation organizations, and eventually from the federal government about the possibility of protecting the island as a national monument or park. The conversations recorded in these letters reveal complex negotiations among family members with different priorities and perspectives. Some wanted to preserve the island exactly as Lucy had left it, maintaining it as a private family retreat regardless of cost. Others felt that such preservation was unrealistic given changing economic circumstances and argued for more flexible approaches that might include limited commercial development or conservation easements. Still, others believed that the family's long-term interest lay in selling or donating the island to public ownership, securing their financial position while also ensuring that the island's natural and cultural resources would be preserved by entities with deeper pockets than individual heirs. Standing in Grayfield's dining room on a January morning in the 1930s or 1940s, arranging the same camellias and winter roses that her grandmother Lucy had arranged decades earlier, a Carnegie granddaughter might look out the tall windows over the same view of dunes and marsh and forest that had been visible from that room since the house was built in 1901. But her perspective on that view had necessarily shifted. What Lucy had seen as a permanent family domain, a controlled environment that would remain essentially unchanged for generations, now appeared more uncertain. The granddaughter would have been aware, even if she didn't dwell on the fact, that geologists and coastal engineers were beginning to document and publicize the vulnerability of barrier islands to sea level rise and storm damage, that the costs of maintaining island infrastructure were rising steadily, and that the social world that had made isolated island estates desirable was fragmenting as travel became easier and as American society became more democratized and less deferential to old money elites. The ritual of flower arranging remained exquisite, the careful selection of blooms, the consideration of color and form, the precise placement in vases that had been in the family for decades. But the ground beneath that ritual had entered a new phase of measurable uncertainty, both geological, as scientific understanding of barrier island dynamics advanced, and social, as the Carnegie family's ability to maintain indefinite control over the island came into question. In learning how to preserve appearances and maintain traditions, the Carnegie women were also, though perhaps without fully realizing it, rehearsing skills they would need for a different kind of work: managing retreat, negotiating with outsiders, deciding what could be preserved and what would have to be surrendered as circumstances changed. By June 1897, as the summer social season reached its height, engagement announcements in the New York Times, Town and Country, and other publications that tracked the movements of elite families increasingly linked island addresses into wider social and geographical maps. A typical pattern might involve a young woman who had spent the winter at Cumberland or Jekyll, moved north to Newport for the late spring and summer, and would honeymoon at Dark Harbor on Islesboro in Maine, or at one of the other exclusive island resorts that dotted the Atlantic coast from Georgia to the Canadian border. These announcements, seemingly simple notifications of private family events, actually represented the culmination of careful social strategy that might have been years in development. Marriage among the Gilded Age elite was rarely a matter of simple romantic attraction. It was an alliance between families, a merger of fortunes and social positions that required careful negotiation and extensive legal documentation. Marriage settlements from this period, preserved in family archives and in court records where disputes led to litigation, reveal the complexity of these arrangements in remarkable detail. A typical marriage settlement might include a dowry provided by the bride's family, often in the form of securities or cash that would generate reliable annual income, property settlements that specified which real estate would belong to the wife personally, a crucial protection in an era when married women's property rights were still limited by law in many states, provisions for the support of future children, and sometimes in families with substantial estates, specific arrangements about access to particular properties. For Carnegie daughters and granddaughters marrying into other wealthy families, these settlements sometimes included explicit guarantees of continued access to Cumberland Island houses, a place reserved for private family use during certain seasons, separate from the city houses where more public entertaining would occur. Within this framework of negotiation and settlement, the act of arranging flowers in an island drawing room carried meanings that extended beyond aesthetic pleasure or domestic routine. It signaled control over a space that had been secured partly by inherited wealth and partly by marriage contract, partly by social position and partly by geographical isolation. a woman arranging roses in her cottage on Islesboro after her honeymoon, or organizing camellia displays in the Grayfield dining room after inheriting her share of Cumberland, was exercising a form of power that was real even if it was confined to relatively narrow domains. She was making decisions about how spaces would look and feel, about what impressions would be created for visitors, about how her family would present itself to the social world. Yet even this power was conditional and constrained in ways that became increasingly apparent over time. Tides and storms could damage island infrastructure, requiring expensive repairs that might or might not be affordable. Shifting social fashions could make particular island retreats seem less desirable, affecting property values and the social capital that accrued from having an address at a particular resort, and changes in the broader economic and political landscape, from progressive era reforms that increased taxes on large estates to the stock market crash of 1929 that destroyed many fortunes, could undermine the financial foundations that made island ownership possible. The islands that had been presented to young women as symbols of permanence, as solid ground that their families would control indefinitely, would eventually prove to be symbols of something quite different: the ultimate fragility of negotiated privilege, the limits of wealth's power to secure lasting control over natural landscapes, the vulnerability of social systems that seemed unshakable to the people living within them, but that were in fact subject to disruption by forces they could not foresee or control. After the stock market crash of October 1929, the winter season of 1929-30 opened at Jekyll Island Club with noticeably thinner guest lists and a subdued atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the confident ebullience of earlier years. Accounts of the club during this period, preserved in club records and in later historical studies, note that many members, including some of the wealthiest families in America, either reduced their travel significantly or quietly allowed their memberships to lapse as the full extent of their financial losses became clear and as maintaining appearances at multiple expensive seasonal residences became difficult or impossible. The Great Depression affected different families in different ways depending on how their wealth was structured and where it was invested. Some industrial fortunes proved more resilient than others. Some banking families actually emerged stronger after the financial system stabilized, but many families that had seemed unassailably wealthy in 1928 found themselves struggling by 1932. The visible manifestation of these struggles was often a contraction of the expensive lifestyle infrastructure that Gilded Age fortunes had built. Winter residences sold or closed, yacht clubs memberships relinquished, staffs reduced, and in some cases, island properties either sold to reduce tax burden or simply allowed to deteriorate when maintenance became unaffordable. On Cumberland Island, by contrast, the Carnegie Trust that Lucy had established before her death in 1916 initially provided insulation from the worst effects of the Depression. Because the island couldn't easily be sold, the trust terms made this very difficult, and because some branches of the Carnegie family had diversified investments that weathered the crash reasonably well, family members continued using their houses on Cumberland through the 1930s, even as some other barrier island estates were being abandoned or sold. National Park Service histories and later environmental studies document continued Carnegie family presence at Grayfield, Plum Orchard, and other island houses through this period, though with reduced staffs and less elaborate entertaining than in earlier decades. But for the women whose lives spanned these decades, who had been raised in the confident opulence of the 1890s and early 1900s and who now found themselves managing reduced circumstances in the 1930s, the emotional and practical calculus of island ownership shifted fundamentally. A private island that had once seemed a bulwark against uncertainty, a controlled environment that demonstrated family power and permanence, now appeared on balance sheets as a liability. Property taxes that had to be paid regardless of income, maintenance costs that seemed to rise every year, insurance premiums, staffing expenses, the cost of keeping hurricane damage at bay, and dealing with the persistent erosion that affected all barrier island structures. Scientific research on barrier islands, which expanded significantly in the mid-20th century as coastal development increased and as the U.S. government invested in understanding coastal processes, began documenting what locals and careful observers had long suspected, that even modest increases in sea level and storm intensity could dramatically increase the expense of defending built structures on barrier islands. Every storm required assessment of damage and repairs. Every year brought higher insurance premiums as actuaries incorporated a growing understanding of coastal risks. Every decade brought new evidence that the ground beneath expensive houses was not as stable as it had appeared when those houses were first built. Cumberland Island, one of the least developed major barrier islands on the Atlantic coast because of the Carnegie family's long control, became an increasingly important site for coastal research precisely because it offered a relatively undisturbed baseline for understanding barrier island dynamics. Geologists mapped its beaches and marshes, documented erosion rates and sediment transport patterns, and published findings that made clear what Carnegie family members were learning through direct experience: that barrier islands are fundamentally temporary features of the coastal landscape, migrating landward over time, and that any structure built on such islands is engaged in a race against geological processes that will eventually win. In private letters and in the ledgers that documented estate finances, the language of refuge and privilege gradually shared space with the language of burden and constraint. The islands were still beautiful, still offered genuine escape from urban noise and pressure, still carried social cachet for those who could afford to maintain them, but they were no longer unambiguous assets. They had become complicated legacies that required constant decision-making about what could be preserved and at what cost. By autumn 1942, as the United States mobilized fully for World War II, the Jekyll Island Club closed its doors for what would prove to be the last regular season, though few realized at the time that the closure would be permanent. Wartime travel restrictions, gasoline rationing, and the broader sense that elaborate displays of wealth were inappropriate while American men were fighting and dying overseas made the club's model of exclusive leisure unsustainable. The decision to close was presented as a temporary wartime measure, but the club never successfully reopened after the war ended in 1945. Photographs from the late 1940s and 1950s preserved in the Jekyll Island Museum and in the collections of former members' families show a slow descent into picturesque decay. Shuttered cottages with paint peeling from salt air exposure, lawns that had once been manicured now growing ragged and wild, gardens returning to the scrubby maritime forest that had covered the island before the club's development. The rituals that had defined Jekyll Island life, the morning walks, the veranda teas, the careful flower arrangements that signaled cultivation and refinement, were replaced by emptiness, by salt wind blowing through broken windows, by the encroachment of natural processes that had been temporarily held at bay by wealth and constant maintenance, but that reasserted themselves as soon as human attention and resources were withdrawn. On Cumberland Island, the trajectory was similar, though not identical. The main Dungeness mansion, which the Carnegie family had left in 1925 after it became too expensive to maintain, suffered from neglect and vandalism through the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. On 27 December 1959, the great house burned in a fire that was later determined to be arson, reducing the structure that had been the centerpiece of Lucy Carnegie's island vision to the dramatic ruins that now stand within Cumberland Island National Seashore. National Park Service archaeological documentation maps what remains: substantial tabby and brick foundations, portions of walls that still reach toward the sky, garden walls and the outlines of former formal planting beds where thousands of seasonal flowers once stood in carefully maintained displays. The abandonment and eventual destruction of these houses was not purely romantic decay or inevitable natural process. It reflected the convergence of multiple factors that made sustaining such structures increasingly difficult. Economic constraints made maintenance expensive. Inheritance laws and estate taxes created pressures to liquidate or donate properties rather than holding them across generations. Rising insurance costs reflected a growing understanding of hurricane risks on barrier islands. and changing social patterns meant that the kind of seasonal migration between multiple family estates that had been normal for wealthy families in 1900 seemed increasingly anachronistic and impractical by 1950. When the women of the Carnegie and other island families stopped coming for the winter season, when the houses stood empty for years at a stretch rather than being occupied and maintained, the islands did not grow quieter in any absolute sense. Instead, they simply resumed their own rhythms, the tempo of natural processes that had been temporarily interrupted by human occupation, but that continued underneath and around that occupation, and that reasserted themselves as soon as the interruption ended. The sound of surf, which had always been present but had been just one element in a more complex soundscape that included human voices and piano music and the clip of garden shears, now dominated. The smell of salt air and marsh, once balanced by the scent of cut flowers and perfume, now stood alone. The visual landscape gradually shifted from the carefully composed views that landscape architects and careful hostesses had created to something wilder and less controlled, more like what the islands had been before the Gilded Age families arrived. In aerial photographs taken during the 1960s and 1970s by the U.S. Geological Survey as part of coastal mapping projects, the empty terraces and ruined foundations of houses like Dungeness look less like stages awaiting their actors' return and more like archaeological relics, remnants of an experiment in imposing human order on a fundamentally dynamic landscape, an experiment that the sea and time were gradually but inexorably erasing, returning the islands to something closer to their pre-development state while still bearing marks of the human occupation that had temporarily transformed them. On 23 October 1972, when President Richard Nixon signed Public Law 92-536, creating Cumberland Island National Seashore, the island's legal and cultural status shifted definitively from private family enclave to protected public landscape, though the transition would prove more complicated and contested than that simple statement suggests. The legislation capped more than a decade of negotiation, lobbying, conflict, and compromise involving Carnegie family members, conservation organizations, the National Park Service, Georgia state officials, and various interested parties with competing visions for the island's future. The negotiations leading to the park's creation reveal the complex mix of motivations and interests that shaped this transformation. Some Carnegie descendants genuinely wanted to preserve the island's natural character and believed that federal protection offered the best guarantee against commercial development. Others felt they had no choice but to sell to the federal government because they could no longer afford the property taxes and maintenance costs associated with island ownership, and selling to the government was preferable to selling to developers who would subdivide and build. Still others bitterly opposed the park creation, feeling that their family's property was being taken through political pressure and that the compensation offered was inadequate. A remarkable 1971 article in The New Yorker by John McPhee, describing a visit to Cumberland before the park was established, includes a map bearing the names of quick and dead Carnegies, noting that many descendants would have preferred to keep the island the way it was. And no wonder. The article captures something of the emotional complexity of the situation, the genuine affection many family members felt for the island and for the way of life it had represented, combined with the practical reality that maintaining private control was becoming increasingly difficult, and that some form of change was inevitable. The final park legislation included provisions for retained rights that allowed certain Carnegie family members to continue occupying their houses for the remainder of their lives or for specified periods, creating a transitional arrangement where the island was simultaneously public park and partially private estate. Grayfield, the house Lucy Carnegie had built for her daughter Margaret, was excluded from the federal purchase and remained in family hands, later being converted into a small, exclusive inn where paying guests could experience something approximating the Carnegie family's island life. The house's library still holds volumes with Lucy Coleman Carnegie's neat ownership inscriptions in ink, physical artifacts connecting the present operation to the family's history. Visitors to Cumberland Island, National Seashore, now walk through the shell of Dungeness, guided by interpretive signs produced by the National Park Service. reading about the Carnegie family's history and about the architecture and engineering that had gone into creating the estate. They hear surf through the empty window frames and wind moving through the ruins in ways that Lucy Carnegie would never have heard when the house was intact, when glass blocked the wind, and when the surf was muffled by walls and furnishings. Where there was once piano music drifting from the parlor, now there is only birdsong and the rustle of vegetation growing up through cracks in the foundations. For Carnegie descendants, the island has become a fundamentally different kind of place, both personal memory, carrying the weight of family history and childhood experiences, and shared public artifact, a landscape where anyone with the price of a ferry ticket can walk paths that were once private, can stand on terraces where only invited guests once stood, can imagine the lives that were lived in houses that are now ruins or museums. The transformation is bittersweet at best, involving genuine loss of family patrimony and control combined with relief that the island has been protected from more destructive forms of development and that its natural values are now preserved for a much wider public than could ever have visited when it was a private estate. The question of who controls access to beauty and who gets to decide how beautiful places should be used has not been resolved so much as shifted to new institutional contexts. The flowers that once stood on dining tables in daily rotation, replaced every few days with fresh blooms cut from the estate gardens, are now wild, growing in patterns determined by ecological processes rather than by human design. But the fundamental questions about the relationship between human desires for control and permanence and natural processes that operate on their own timescales according to their own logic remain relevant and pressing. In the early decades of the 21st century, scientists studying the Georgia coast used GPS, aerial photography, LIDAR, light detection and ranging technology, and historical map analysis to document erosion rates and coastal change with unprecedented precision. Their findings, published in peer-reviewed journals and in reports for the National Park Service and other agencies, paint a detailed picture of how barrier islands like Jekyll, Little Cumberland, and Cumberland itself are changing in response to rising sea levels, shifting sediment budgets, and the increasing frequency and intensity of coastal storms associated with climate change. Studies of Jekyll Island, which became a Georgia state park in 1947 after years of negotiation to purchase the island from its private owners, document that more than half of the island's ocean-facing beaches have experienced significant retreat since systematic measurements began in the mid-19th century. The northern end of the island has been particularly affected, with beach widths in some locations reduced by 30% or more, and with back barrier marshes showing patterns of vegetation change and channel migration driven by rising water levels and altered tidal dynamics. These changes have necessitated extensive and expensive beach renourishment projects and infrastructure modifications to protect the historic district where the old Jekyll Island Club buildings have been preserved and converted into a resort hotel. On Cumberland Island, coastal vulnerability assessments conducted for the National Park Service identify numerous cultural and natural resources that are threatened by future erosion and storm surge. Structures like the ruins of Dungeness, the waterwheel house remnant from the earlier plantation era, and various outbuildings and landscape features associated with the Carnegie estates all lie within zones that geological models predict will experience increased exposure to storm damage. And erosion as sea levels continue to rise through the 21st century. The Park Service faces difficult choices about how much to invest in protecting these resources, whether some should be allowed to erode naturally while others are defended, and how to interpret the inevitable changes for visitors who expect historical sites to remain unchanged. Meanwhile, the cultural legacy of the Gilded Age barrier island estates survives primarily in documentary form and in carefully managed heritage tourism narratives. Brochures for the restored Jekyll Island Club, which now operates as a resort hotel where anyone with sufficient means can stay, invoke the island's exclusive history, while making that history accessible to a much broader public. Interpretive signs at Cumberland Island, National Seashore, and at Acadia National Park on Mount Desert Island tell the stories of the wealthy families who once dominated these landscapes, their relationship to the natural environments they sought to control, and the eventual transitions that made these places publicly accessible. Travel articles in magazines and newspapers regularly feature these islands, often framing them as places haunted by past wealth, where one can glimpse the lifestyle of America's Gilded Age elite while also enjoying spectacular natural beauty. The heiresses who once staged carefully orchestrated performances of refinement in these settings now appear mainly as names in caption lists identifying women in historic photographs, or as brief biographical sketches in interpretive materials, or as characters in popular histories that attempt to make their world comprehensible to contemporary readers, for whom the social rules and assumptions of the Gilded Age can seem almost incomprehensibly alien. Their daily rituals, including that act of arranging flowers against the sea that Lucy Carnegie performed and taught to her daughters, and that they in turn taught to their daughters, are preserved, if at all, in brief mentions in guidebooks, in memoirs that few people read, in archive photographs that show women standing beside elaborate floral displays in drawing rooms and on verandas. The flowers themselves, ephemeral in their original context, are now doubly absent, the actual blooms long since wilted and discarded, and the gardens where they grew either destroyed or transformed into something wilder and less controlled. In a museum somewhere, perhaps the Jekyll Island Museum, perhaps in the collections of the Museum of Coastal History in St. Simons or in one of the Carnegie family members' own preserved papers, there might be a case where a monogrammed handkerchief bearing Lucy Carnegie's initials sits alongside a pressed island flower, its color faded to brown but its form still recognizable, and a photograph of a porch at Dungeness or Grayfield where a low bowl of camellias stands on a wicker table, the composition carefully arranged by someone who has long since died, but whose aesthetic sensibility is preserved in this image. The sea outside these museum spaces, outside the preserved historic districts and the interpretive centers and the carefully maintained ruins, continues its slow work of reshaping these islands, moving sand from one location to another, eroding here and accreting there, migrating landward in response to rising water levels in patterns that will continue regardless of human desires or efforts at intervention. Inside the museum cases and in the archived photographs and documents, the curated remnants of Gilded Age grace invite a quieter question, one without easy answers. What does it mean to preserve memory of worlds that were themselves attempting to preserve privilege against time and change, worlds built on the temporary stability of shifting sand and sustained by wealth that seemed permanent but proved as conditional and mobile as the islands themselves? The same kind of flowers that Lucy Carnegie once turned carefully toward the light on a February morning in 1904, adjusting them stem by stem until the arrangement satisfied her sense of order and beauty, now sit perfectly still in an archival print, their colors faded to sepia, their three-dimensional reality reduced to patterns of light and dark on paper. Beyond the frame of that photograph, invisible in the static image but always present in the actual world the photograph documented, the islands themselves keep moving, keep changing, keep demonstrating that permanence was always an illusion, that control was always temporary, that even the most carefully maintained gardens ultimately belong not to the people who plant them, but to time and tide.